Hello, welcome to the 5th annual StoryFest. My name is Latorial Faison, and the title of this session is The Missed Education of the Negro in the Rural South, Oral Histories on Race, Culture, and Identity. I am excited to be with you today. Thank you for joining me here at StoryFest, where I can talk about my most recent research and writing in terms of storytelling via oral history, narrative portraiture, and using poetry as an analytical device. Let's get our screen shared here. To tell you a little bit about myself, I am a poet, author, assistant professor at Virginia State University, which is one of the nation's premier historically Black colleges and universities. We are located in Virginia. I am also a 28-year military spouse. I am a mother of 3. I'm a poet, author, and an independent researcher and scholar. To talk to you a little bit about the title of this session and the title of my research, I grew up in a rural county in Southampton County, Virginia. And early on, as a little girl, I was intrigued by individuals, family members, community members who I thought acted differently, spoke differently, and carried themselves in a different, more excellent way. Those individuals were students who had attended or graduated from the neighboring segregated Black high school in my town. The name of that school was Riverview High School. It was formerly known as Southampton County Training Center. This research sort of happened when I enrolled in a doctoral program in education. And I fell into this research as my culminating research project for my doctoral dissertation. I wanted to find a way that I could do research on this group of individuals in Southampton County who had graduated from Riverview High School. Now, had research been done, have these stories been told? There are other writers and scholars who have written about Black segregated education history, who've collected stories. Many of those stories have been about educators. No one had really written about Riverview High School or the students who came out of Southampton County. And there are not a lot of stories that capture the student version of that oral history. When we think about Black segregated education, when we think about schools, we typically think about desegregation, we think about integration, and we think of the Little Rock Nine, or we think about Ruby Bridges and her story. But there were tons of students who, were educated during Jim Crow, during very challenging time. And so I took this opportunity to go and collect stories, which would become oral history on this Black segregated education lived experience. And it was a rich experience. When we think about telling our stories, we think about narrative, we think about stories that have been passed down in our families, in our communities from generation to generation, typically and historically in African communities in Native Africa. Oral history was the way that things were passed down. And of course, we know the history of my people, or African Americans in this nation. Much of that history was lost due to so many different variables, languages, But when we think about telling our stories, I want to focus in this presentation on race, culture, and identity. And I can talk to you a little bit about why I chose to focus on these areas in my oral history collection and in my writing. There were a couple of reasons why I really wanted to do this project. One, I wanted to document this amazing experience that these individuals had. And it was an amazing experience. It was amazing because though these students were living through one of the most challenging times socially and politically, education was at the forefront. Education was a key. Education was the avenue or the route that students and individuals took to lift themselves up, to fight discrimination, to fight racism, and to better themselves. There's sort of a twofold mission that I use in creating this oral history project. One was it was not just about telling these stories. It was also about looking at where education lies today, looking at where I believe the African American community is dealing with some challenges today, socially and politically and educationally. Much of the research that has been done, on education and public schools, we talk about, addressing barriers, closing achievement gaps for African Americans and other minority students. And so I wanted to take a look at what was it that these Black educators and these Black schools were supplying in the Jim Crow South, particularly in my area, that was culminating in Black excellence and Black success and achievement for African Americans in spite of the tough times that they were experiencing. And so when I took a look at those stories, these are some major themes that came to the forefront: race, culture, identity, what it actually means to be Black. And so this shined through in the oral history that I was able to collect. How is culture formed, or how was culture formed then, and how was it continued? And then finally, identity. How is identity influenced? How was it influenced in this educational setting? And how was it affirmed? There were several outcomes to the oral history project. And of course, to inspire, these individuals were able to triumph through adversity, many of them, more than a few of them, a significant amount of them. Another outcome of this research, when you take on an oral history project and when you profess to write it, you are literally reclaiming your narrative, you're reclaiming and telling your own story. When others tell your story, we know what that end result is. It's 2023, where we're actually fighting to control our narrative, fighting to have African American and other histories included, in school curriculum. And so we want to reclaim that. And you can reclaim that when you're actually, taking the plunge into oral history. There's truth in it. There's truth in listening to others tell their stories and hearing their experience. Then also another outcome is recentering that story, the African American story. And I know that as an African American woman, coming out of this era and coming, up through this educational pipeline that was created before me, I knew early on that my story was just as important in the American story as anybody else's. And today I know that my story is just as important in the global story as anyone else's. And so I know that many of those stories have not been told. And when I started this research project, just about every story that I collected, had some richness to it, some amazing facet that needed to be heard. And finally, an outcome of telling our stories and collecting oral history is to educate, to train, and for development, professional development, especially in terms of dealing with teaching our children in schools, educating our children, training our teachers, and training nonprofits, training individuals who are working in the communities. Many people want to go into underprivileged communities, but a lot of times, if you don't know about those individuals that you're seeking to help, you can do more harm than good. And so there's a lot of importance and a lot of essentials in getting this out there. It's crucial that we get our stories out there. I think about The Hill We Climb. The Hill We Climb was a poem penned. It was by the inaugural poet Amanda Gorman. And in this poem, she took the time to frame where we are as a nation. She did it positively, while also mentioning the challenges that we have as citizens in this nation. And, it's a constant hill that we climb, not just in education, but just in our own individuality as African Americans in this nation. And so I'd like to think of the hill we climb, and then we think how recently, you know, politicians, in a state in our nation, have okayed banning literature or poems or works, oral works such as The Hill We Climb. It's not a divisive concept. It's a teaching concept. It's an oral history piece. It was Amanda Gorman telling the American story as she, a little African American girl, witnessed it unfold. And to be denied the opportunity to share that history is an opportunity, is being denied to share your voice. And what a lot of times, leaders don't understand is that when you tell a minority, when you tell me as an African American that to share my experience, to share my story is a divisive concept, that kind of leads an entire group to believe that you're totally disregarding their history, you're disregarding their voice, you're disregarding how they feel. And so we want to take a look at telling stories, whatever stories you have to tell, whether it's a family story, whether it's an experience that you've had in this nation, in your family, on a job, in a community, whatever that story is important, and your voice deserves to be heard. Your ancestors' voices deserve to be heard. As we gather as writers, there are a couple of things that we want to consider. We come as writers, we come as storytellers, we come as creatives, but what we do is we come bearing witness and bearing responsibility to literally documenting our times, documenting history, and we do so in the spirit of truth. We're not writing fiction in oral history. We're actually telling how we felt, telling how something made us feel, whether it be a law that was created, whether, it could be anything, something someone said. We are living in a time where, we just celebrated, we celebrate the 4th of July every year, which is America's independence. Juneteenth has been celebrated by many African Americans because what we know as independence was not July 4th, it was Juneteenth. And so we need to think in terms of, how we recenter that narrative. Number 2, as we gather as writers, when we tell stories, we capture the struggle, we capture the discouragement, we capture the loss. But just like in Amanda Gorman's poem, we also capture the hope, the triumph, and the victory. In terms of my research and my oral history experiment, well, it started as an experiment and it ended up as an oral history project. The Black segregated education experience is rich in culture and identity and history and individuality, the foundation of educational excellence. What I found from this project is identity. We do like to talk about identity a lot, but today when we talk about identity, we don't really talk about the root of it, of cultural identity. One of the things that this research project caused me to focus on was African American students and what happens to them in educational classrooms all over America. What I found is that, number one, I came through public schools myself that were integrated. And I have literally put 2 grown sons through public schools all across America as a military family. We've moved all across the nation. And having watched, I have a 3rd son who's in high school right now, but watching my Black sons navigate, the public school system, what I found is that if their identities had not been, affirmed at home or in a Black community, the chances of them knowing who they are, and learning that from a public school setting are very few and far between, depending on where they were. My students, my sons have typically not attended all Black schools, so they didn't have a Riverview experience. This school was Riverview High School, formerly Southampton County Training School. All of the administrators and the teachers were of color. But what I found from collecting the oral history, from collecting their stories, if you look at this infographic on identity in terms of how we establish identity, in establishing identity, we learn how to manage our emotions. We develop competence. We develop purpose. We develop integrity. We develop mature interpersonal relationships, and we develop autonomy to interdependence. These are the foundations that the select group of African American students who are attending Black segregated high schools or schools of color, whether they were the original or the early 1-room and 2-room schools, this is how their identity was being framed. When we think about, Black history today, depending on where you are, students may not get to study much Black history or African American history at all. If so, you're limited to that 1 month, that's Black History Month. But by having Black educators and Black leaders, these students were able to, every day when they went to school, have their identity and their color affirmed and be okay with that and be at peace with that. They had examples to look up to. Also in this project, education, of course, you couldn't help but pay attention to the excellence and the achievement. Many of these students were involved in extracurricular activities. They went on to do wonderful things. Not every single one of them went on to college, but even those who didn't go to college, they had social skills and civic skills and skills that allowed them to go out and to be successful. What this oral history project also revealed is that, in order for students to be successful, there was sort of this triumvirate or this three-legged stool that had to exist. And it was the bond between the school, family, and community. And when I say community, I'm typically talking about the Black church. In the South, the Black church was an amazing presence, was a huge presence and influence and support. It was a resource. And it's still that way today. When we talk about Black segregated schools, many of the textbooks and resources and supplies that were needed in Black high schools were funded by the community. They were funded by parents who, got together, created or donated funds or collected funds, and they did so through their churches and their community organizations. So it was very important. So much came out of this oral history project. I interviewed 16 participants for this research project, and I saw these 16 participants as a continuation of the Riverview experience, a continuation of the Black segregated education experience. And what I noticed, or what I collected from their stories, is that what they learned at Riverview, they took it into their everyday lives when they left Riverview. And not only did they take it, they tried to reach back and give someone else the experience that they too had garnered at their Black segregated high school. This is a graphic of the 16 individuals, participants for the research project. I wanted to cover a vast amount of ground. Riverview High School was organized in the late 30s. The last class graduated in 1970. Due to the Brown versus Board of Education, many of the schools were desegregated and began the integration process. But in Southampton County, Riverview High School was one of the last, if not the last school to actually desegregate. You had African Americans and people of color who were still trying to hold on to this wonderful, safe educational space for their children, because they knew that with desegregation would come more challenges. Their children would be exposed to the horrors and the rigors of Jim Crow. What I did with the 16 participants to protect their anonymity for the dissertation process, they were all given aliases, and I chose aliases that were named after famous Black writers. But as you can see, most all of the participants were retired, except the last two from the class of 1970, who are currently still working and fully employed. But there's a great variety. They are educators, they are government workers, senior executives, they are pastors, they are counselors, they work in law enforcement, they're pastors, they're business owners. They are veterans. They went into the military. They're community organizers and volunteers. Some of them are IT personnel, a mathematician. Many of them are creatives. You know, they have gone on to do some amazing things after leaving their Black segregated education experience. These are the stories that I wanted to tell. And in telling the stories, it was really hard to not focus on the demographics in the actual research project. And I'm only going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. In our storytelling, sometimes we overlook the numbers. And I challenge you as a writer, as a storyteller, you know, if you can collect demographics, because I believe the demographics tell a story. These students came from different types of families. If their parents were deceased, they were raised by grandparents. If there were no grandparents, they were possibly raised by aunts and uncles, but most of them came from two-parent families. You can see the age groups that I interviewed. 75% of them were in their 70s. In terms of marriage and domestic partnership, 75% were married at the time that I collected their stories. 12.5% were widowed, 6% divorced. So if we look at this, 75, 85, 86, 87, 93, almost 94% of them were married. Okay, if we look at retirement, 87% were retired. Some are still working even though they are retired. I think this is an even greater demographic to pay attention to. Those students who went on to historically Black colleges and universities, as opposed to those who went to predominantly white institutions. And I can tell you only 2 out of the 16 attend a predominantly white institution immediately after leaving their Black segregated education experience, whether it was in the 50s, 60s, or in 70. 85.71% attended historically Black colleges and universities. And why do you think that is? They wanted to continue to have the experience that they had in their safe, segregated Black high school. They knew that they could, many of them testified that the parents knew that they would be safe there. Remember, this is still Jim Crow. You took a lot of risk and you took a major chance going to a PWI, not knowing that what you'd be subjected to, and it would be a totally different experience. If you take a look at the other demographics in terms of what they were able to go on to achieve here, 43.7% achieved master's degrees, another 37.5 bachelor's, and a small percentage did receive doctoral or professional degrees. Trade schools were represented as well as associate degrees. Take a look at the right chart. This was one of the surprises that I found in doing the research and collecting this oral history. I knew that there was a heavy Native American presence in my county, Southampton County, but I just wasn't thinking about it when I was collecting the research. I was into collecting the Black experience. It was a Black high school, but this Black high school actually, there were many students who were of color who were not necessarily African American. Many of them were Native American or mixed race Native American. So there was that presence there as well. And so that was some history that I was also able to collect. One of the individuals that I actually interviewed and collected the story is currently the tribal chief down in the county, and she shared some Native American history that was very important. And she talks about how, you know, as a Native American, you literally couldn't talk about being Native American. It was against the law. Everybody was considered of color. And it wasn't until the Loving case in Virginia that, you know, Native Americans were actually able to verbally, you know, affirm who they were as people in groups, in schools, you know, anywhere in public. So just some amazing, amazing things come out of oral history when you hear other people's story. It was really a rich experience for me to collect these stories in particular, because in the Black community, colorism and ethnicity and race, they become such defining pieces of who we are, defining segments, you know, in our lives. And it determines so much, you know. I've heard so many times just in my life, I'm 50 years old this year, and I've been places as a military spouse, had the pleasure and beauty of living all over the nation and even abroad. And sometimes people wonder why I discuss race so much. It's hard not to discuss race when race has been made to be a part of who you are. And so for every single one of these individuals, it would be great if they could look back at growing up. It would be awesome if they could look at, you know, going through an educational system and not for a single day having to focus on their race, but they did. Every day they got up and walked outside of their homes, they knew they were Black, because the Jim Crow America, a Jim Crow South, a Jim Crow Virginia reminded them of that. And they were reminded that they were Black every time they got on their school bus and went into their Black schools and had to pass the white schools, or when they opened up a textbook and they saw words like nigger or other, you know, crazy things written, you know, to offend them in these textbooks. You know, what we often hear in history is that Black schools were underprivileged. The students didn't get a good education. That couldn't have been further from the truth. Black students in the South, many of them received a top education because many of their educators had gone on to be formally educated, master's degrees. Some of them, you know, from the Little Rock Nine, Minnie Jean, she testified that her high school principal had a doctoral degree. And when she actually helped to integrate, you know, the school in Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, many of the teachers there did not have the same educational credentials as the Black teachers at the school she had left. And it was the same here. It was the same that I found here at Riverview. Just in doing the research, I found out that when the schools were integrated here in Southampton County, many of the non-Black teachers who were teaching at the white high school were only teaching with teaching certificates. So once the schools did integrate, you know, they were forced to go back to get the proper credentials, when many of the Black teachers already had, you know, bachelor's degrees, certifications in education, and master's degrees. So it's important. That's a piece of our narrative that's not out there. That's why it's important to reclaim your own narrative, to tell your own story, and to center your own self in history. Because for so long, we have been left out of telling our own story. We won't even talk about how the Daughters of the Confederacy played a part in creating textbooks all over the South, you know. And so when we look at it, it's important. Take a look at these graduates, look at these Black graduates. When we think about telling their stories, so many of them had teacher stories to tell. They had home stories to tell. They had, you know, extracurricular stories to tell about how they grew as people, how the teachers taught them, you know, so much about life, not just academics. The teachers gave them the social skills that would help them to go out and be able to navigate life. And many of them testified that they could do that because they too had gone down that road of racism and segregation, but that they had succeeded. And these students believe that because their teachers had succeeded, they could as well. As I wrote these stories, you know, every single story out of the 16 touched me. And as you can see, these are some of the titles. In collecting my oral history, I wanted to find one line from their story that pretty much was iconic or spoke to, their lived experience. And so for whose eyes are you looking through? Mrs. Harrison and the $50 scholarship. They never said you couldn't do it. They were teachers, but they were reachable. I didn't have to prove anything to be who I was. The correlation between behavior and achievement. Black male teachers, a world of difference. Stepping stone to a promised land. And if you see the biblical allegory in there, in that particular title, it's just so because that particular participant went on to become an ordained pastor and the first female pastor of the church in which she grew up. What we gave up to just survive. Speak like you know what you're talking about. This participant talked about that Black excellence. When you hear or when you see people who graduated from Black segregated high schools, they enunciated their words. They spoke with dignity. And so this individual talks about how he took that away with him and how he carried that with him into the military and into his professional life, and how that actually opened doors for him. Ahead of the game, God bless Mr. Hatcher. If we didn't have Riverview, what would have happened to us? Riverview made Jim Crow bearable. They wanted excellence out of us. The epitome of an African village is what how one participant described the experience. And finally, a historically Black high school. I'm going to take a moment and talking about two of the profiles or two of the portraits. In doing this research, I use narrative portraiture as a qualitative research device. And narrative portraiture is where you basically collect oral history and you paint a portrait. You paint a picture of what you've actually collected. You're giving that person's story. So I want to take for a moment just to give you an example. We will look at the portrait of Maya, named after Maya Angelou. Maya graduated from Southampton County Training School. The school hadn't been named Riverview yet. And the title of her story is Whose Eyes Are You Looking Through? And just to give you a few tidbits about Maya, these are things that I collected in gathering, her, from her oral history. She was a sharecropper's daughter. She was an advanced kid, but she was an advanced kid with special needs, social special needs, physical special needs. She was gifted. She came from a strong parent household. Her parents were not formally educated, but they were very strong parents in making sure that she and her siblings were cared for and educated, instilling different values in them. Her parents were involved in PTA. She was a strong advanced reader, and she was, she set an example for her siblings. She took advantage of early CTE, career technical education. And she talks about in her story how it was a business class that was almost denied her that really set her on the path to becoming a business education teacher. It was that class that changed her life, a typing class. She discusses notions of beauty, and for Black girls particularly, and Black boys as well, body image and how we see ourselves can be, a major part of identity development and how we actually develop. She talks about the school being one of safety, that, she was encouraged there and she was also inspired. She went on to become college educated, a retired teacher, married, currently widowed. She's a mother and a grandmother. What she believes most of all about this Black segregated education experience is that it extremely prepared her, for life. And that single typing class that she talks about. She went on to attend Cottrell Business College, Allen University, and Norfolk State University. Some of the tidbits that I take from her oral history, her oral narrative. Maya had never known anything other than segregation at this time in her life. She said she always believed in separate but equal. She saw the value in separate but equal. She had no problem with being separate, but the issue was not being equal. So these students knew early on that they were not being treated as equal citizens in society. You knew that when you went to school, you knew that when you went to town. As Maya became older, she realized that Black people and Black children were not treated equal. When she thinks of integration or desegregating a school, she was glad that she did. She says, I probably would have fought back and I would not have been a good candidate um, to desegregate a school. Her experience at Southampton County Training School helped her decide what kind of teacher she wanted to be, what kind of educator, and what kind of person. She says, I thought about some of the things that I went through. I worked hard at trying to make the children feel that they were loved, that they were somebody. And I think most of all, she says, at Black children, people looked at Black children as if they didn't think they were worthy of praise or something like that. It was something that was withheld from most of us. This is what the Jim Crow, the racist Jim Crow, the divisive Jim Crow. This is what divisive is. Jim Crow was a divisive concept, but us going back to learn about this history in order to not repeat it, in order to become a better democracy, in order to produce, better, kinder, more loving citizens. That's not a divisive concept. And she talks about how race was such an affirming aspect of identity for Black children back then. But the great takeaway from Maya's story, her oral narrative, was whose eyes are you looking through? She had learned not to see herself through the eyes of the racist white world of Jim Crow that was only focused on her limitations, people who had written her off because she was a poor sharecropper's daughter, off the farm, differently able, socially awkward, and seemingly out of place. What she says is that she saw herself through the eyes of her mother, her father, and every Black teacher and mentor from Southampton County to South Carolina who had seen something beautiful in her and told her to go ahead. She saw herself through the eyes of her God. So just amazing stories. And believe it or not, some little girl somewhere in the nation, on the continent, needs to hear this story to affirm her own identity. I'll focus on one other story that I was able to collect out of the 16, and I named this individual Malcolm in the study. Malcolm came out of the class of 1961. All of these participants had stories that became near and dear to me. They were my favorites. This is one of the stories that I also particularly love to talk about and share. He says, of the Black educators at Riverview or Southampton County Training School, he says they never said you couldn't do it. Never said you couldn't do it. Malcolm came from a formally educated family. He was the grandson of an educator. So he says the pattern was already set in terms of education for him. His father worked for banks, which was sort of an upper echelon for a Black man to have in the Jim Crow South. His mother cleaned the courthouse in our county. His family was very community oriented. They were very creative. They either taught school or they did music. They worked in the church. They coached sports or extracurricular activities, either at the school or in the community. He says family and school developed a strong work ethic for him, a sense of independence and structure. Malcolm was working like 2 jobs while he was a teenager. He also realized the magnitude of his Black school educators and his education in college. It really, he said what they taught him really showed up in college. It really set him apart. And he was able to see the value of his Black segregated education experience once he went on to college and into the working world. Malcolm was a U.S. military veteran, and he's also a graduate of Norfolk State University. These are some of the tidbits of oral history that I took away from him telling his story. He says, the white people, I remember, the little bus we used to catch and the little teeny school there in Cortland. And you could go downtown and there was Cortland Elementary School. We got their books. In those books, there was profanity. There was the N-word, because those people knew that we were going to get those books. I would have been scared to death at an integrated school because back in those days, we would have had big problems. But because I was in a Black school, I was nurtured. People looked out for me. There was always somebody, even though it looked like it was horrible, it was a nurturing by the folks, the teachers. He says the teachers were on you, the neighbors were on you, the ministers were on you. So there really was the sense of an entire village raising a child. And it was clear from the school to the home, every neighbor's house, every church. Malcolm went on to achieve a lot, but what he says of Southampton County Training School, he said they never said you can't do it. I don't remember ever having a teacher at Southampton that didn't think you could do all things. And that, said Malcolm, is what gets you off the ground floor. When I collected his story, I thought, for right now, even in today's America, in schools all over the place, how that is so important, not just for African American kids, for Black kids, but for minority kids, for kids who have immigrated here. Their families have immigrated here. When you know that someone believes in you, that gets you off the ground floor. He said it wasn't always about what these Black educators said. Sometimes it was what they didn't say to the students at Riverview High School. They never said you couldn't do it. I couldn't tell you, I'm a college professor, and today I always, I encounter students every year, even as recent as this year. I hear from students who say some guidance counselor, some teacher told them they were not college material. It is very important for African American students who already have this history, this tragic history, this tragic story. And I don't even like using those words, but that's the truth. Zora Neale Hurston is the only reader, anthropologist, oral history collector that I know of who talks about how she's not a tragic. She's not some tragic piece of America. She doesn't focus on that history. Instead, she's constantly looking for opportunity. If people have a problem with her, that's their problem. But Malcolm, reaffirms that having teachers believe that you can do all things, that gets you started in life. And so these are just two of the stories that I was able to collect. Two pieces of the oral history from this project that were of utmost importance, carry so much value. I mentioned talking about using narrative portraiture as a device, where poetic analysis was another device that I used in collecting these stories. This is a poem that resulted in this oral history project. It seemed that everyone I knew had walked the halls of Riverview. Black students, Black educators, Black coaches, Black administrators. It was higher learning for higher living. Therein, Black pride, it was a given. Black professionals, Black innovators, Black cooks, custodians, and incubator. Influencers of lifelong excellence, Southern Negro school of prominence. Black teachers wielding a unique ethic of care for students caught up in Jim Crow stare. With inadequate funding and grim outlooks, this pedagogy was not found in books. Young students of color could hope to find the climate and tools to broaden their minds. The will to learn, to survive each day, with descendants of slaves paving the way. Academics, athletics, social clubs, and art. Negro schools were safe and well-rounding at heart. Institutional promotion of dignity, self-respect, cultural awareness, achievement, and intellect. Racial uplift, community, respect, and pride. These pillars and principles could not be denied. Black segregated schools let us never forget the phenomenon, the experience. May we borrow from our dark past best as we ignite new flames of excellence. This poem, Segregated but Educated, was a result of collecting these oral stories, this oral history. Out of this project, where I focus on oral histories, race, culture, and identity, when we think about telling our stories, these are some of the questions that we, can focus on answering as we seek to collect stories that tell stories. What can we learn from our lived experiences that help others have hope? And clearly we find, or I found from these 16 individuals, that they had strategies. They had strategies for dealing with the challenges of their time. What must we tell in search of truth, hope, democracy, global awareness, racial reckoning, etc.? What must we tell? When I was collecting this history, I literally gave way for these individuals to tell any and everything they wanted to tell about their personal lives, their personal journey, their lived experience. Nothing was off limits. How does storytelling lead to healing the mind, the body, and the soul, restoring the whole person? These individuals, even at a young age, were confronted with dealing with moral questions. They had moral questions and dilemmas. What we find out is just the emotional turmoil of racism and having to deal with Jim Crow, segregation, and discrimination, that it affected people emotionally, psychologically. How does storytelling lead to healing, those instances, that trauma? I remember there was one participant who said, "Thank you for coming back to hear our stories." They were all so excited to tell their stories. I had to turn some people away from this research project, but I'm hoping to work with them and gather their stories, for a latter project. How do our stories influence justice, inclusion, and tolerance in communities? DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion are, that's just, it's been politicized, but it's definitely popular to talk about inclusion. How will these stories that you want to collect help you? Help to influence justice in the areas of inclusion and tolerance in our communities? How and where can writers share the experiences and the oral history narratives that we develop? This is an important question, because after you collect this history, you can either publish it in a book, but there are so many other things that you can do with this history. I choose to present this history at conferences. I publish this history. I share it everywhere people will listen. Where can writers find help, resources, and funding? Most recently, I became the recipient of a Virginia Humanities Fellowship, which is grant funding that provides, funds for researchers or people to tell Virginia stories. And so this is my next project, telling our Virginia stories, the missed education of the Negro. I believe that this history left a legacy of hope. It was a Black segregated education experience, but it was one of hope. If you know someone who's interested in telling this type of Virginia story, please have them contact me by email. I'm looking for essays, stories, documents, photos, creative works, poems, songs, lyrics. And I'm also collecting illustrations, but I'm also conducting more interviews. And I would love to hear and collect many other stories of this experience. I have written several books. The Miseducation of the Negro is one of them, but there's several others. All of my books are available at Amazon.com and Barnes and Noble. I take invitations to schools, virtual presentations, face-to-face presentations to share this history and to talk about writing. In terms of telling our stories, I do want to thank you for attending the 5th annual StoryFest. Thank you for spending the time with me. I hope you'll take the time to check out many of the other sessions on the 2023 schedule for StoryFest. And we hope to see you again next year. Thank you for spending the time with me as I discuss the miseducation of the Negro, oral histories about culture, race, and identity. Thank you.